What you're about to hear is an excerpt from a wind band piece called American Elegy by American composer Frank Kelly. Take a listen to this excerpt and ask yourself, musically, what's going to happen next?
For a lot of us with musical training, we can pretty much figure out what's going to happen next. That last chord, which was an F chord in the key of B flat major, is the dominant. And so naturally, what will happen next is Do. And wasn't that satisfying? Isn't it nice to be right when you can just figure out what's about to happen? Well, Frank Kelly knows that, and he probably knows that at a certain point, even an untrained listener will get used to that really beautiful cadence. But let's listen to what happens later in the piece. Wow, even just listening to that now gave me chills. I mean, that is a beautiful example of a deceptive cadence, and the very root of that cadence is that word, deception. It violated our expectations. After hearing that phrase a couple times throughout the course of the piece, Kelly takes us on an emotional turn right at that cadence point in a way that a lot of people aren't expecting. The gravity of that very moment and the whole piece itself is made even more impactful just by knowing what the piece is about. American Elegy was written in memorial of the victims of the Columbine Massacre, a school shooting that happened in 1999. With that narrative in mind, and what Kelly does compositionally throughout the course of the piece, it's no denying that American Elegy is incredibly emotional. But how does a piece of music make us even consider emotion? How do simple waves in the air cause something as physiological as goosebumps? But first, let's ask the question, what is emotion? An emotion is the response of a whole organism to some type of input. So, this response usually takes place in one or more of these three domains. The first is the physiological domain. This response, which is internal, could involve something like secreting a hormone into the bloodstream, sweating, a lump in the throat feeling, or even goosebumps. The second domain is some type of expressive behavior. This is usually observable and external. So for example, someone might be smiling or stomping about or even crying. And finally, there's usually a cognitive component, cognition referring to the way we think or process. And the cognitive part of an emotion is usually the appraisal or the evaluation of the emotion that the organism is feeling. So for example, I am feeling sad. That is simply just an appraisal of the internal state. All that being said, let's go back to what we were talking about earlier. Expectation. Expectation's such a vague word, and really, what does it have to do with emotion? Well, first, let's take ourselves way back in history, back to early humanity.
Arguably, one of the most important parts of human survival was being able to understand and anticipate what's about to happen in our landscape. Seeing something interesting or being able to detect changes in our environment was one of the only ways we'd be able to hunt and avoid being hunted ourselves. Picture yourself as an early human, ready to go to bed, having found a safe place to sleep at night. You're listening to your auditory environment. Everything seems good, until a sudden sound. Could it be a branch breaking? Could it be a twig snapping on the ground? Is it a hunter? Could it be dinner? What was it?
Right as that sound happened, what do you think as an early human your body would have done? Maybe immediately you get a burst of adrenaline from your limbic system. And then maybe you get up and look around and survey your environment. And what are you thinking to yourself? Are you scared? Are you hungry? And so you're excited to see what's out there? All of these things
are examples of what could happen emotionally because of your auditory environment, and it all comes back to expectations. At the end of the day, all of our sensory systems are here to help us as an organism survive. And really, we have to make sure we proportion our resources to be meaningfully used. It's not helpful if at all times we're constantly hyper aware of what's going on. So think about expectation in this way. As a human, we need to be aware not of consistency, but of change. When something surprising or shocking happens in our environment, like for example, a sudden prick on our arm when we're used to feeling our clothes, or the sound of a loud bang going off beside us, those changes are a violation of our comfort. They're a violation of our expectations, and they pump us up for action. To our biological bodies, attention and cognitive power are both precious resources. How we allocate those completely depends on the comfort and the familiarity we have with our environment. When expectations are met, we like that. It's pleasant. It's not surprising at all. It means we can relax. However, when expectations are violated, that is when our attention is grabbed the most. And today, we're going to talk about how expectation and music combine. To do that, we're going to use a framework developed by musician and psychologist David Huron, who is currently a professor at Ohio State University. We're going to look at David Huron's theory of music and expectation called the ITPRA theory. David Huron's ITPRA theory is a theory that he developed with the arts in mind. He believed that humans' emotional reaction to the arts came back to that biological feat of expectation and its role it has in our cognition and survival. The ITPRA theory, though, can also be applied to non-artistic or non-musical endeavors, and I'll demonstrate that later. The ITPRA theory breaks down expectation into two parts. The first set of events happen before a specific outcome, and the last part of the events happen after a specific outcome. Every letter of ITPRA stands for a word, and let's break down what those letters mean. The first letter, I, stands for imagination, and that's a cognitive process where we anticipate and predict events. For example, if we're an early human and we're sitting in our environment ready to go to bed, we're imagining either one of two things. One, we sleep well through the night, or two, something will interrupt our sleep. I bet we all will have some type of reaction to each of those options. But no matter what, we use foresight to try and anticipate that. We imagine. The second letter of the ITPRA theory is T, and T stands for tension. At this point, we have some type of event that's going to prime us to react. Let's say in our example with the early human, we have that sound, that branch or that twig snapping or something rustling in the woods. Well, typically one of two things are going to happen. One, we're going to have some type of physiological reaction, which would mean the activation of our autonomic nervous system or sympathetic nervous system. And two, some type of perceptual attention grab. We're suddenly going to be hooked and ready to react to whatever might come of that sound. So once that early human has heard that sound, it's now time to come face to face with the outcome. The early human could be thinking, this could be some type of predator, it's out to get me and I'm not safe to go to bed. And then a squirrel comes running out of the bushes. Now we have our post-outcome set of events in the ITPRA theory. The next letter is P, which stands for the prediction response. The prediction response is largely an unconscious evaluation of valence. Valence is the degree to which something is perceived as good or is perceived as bad. Whether or not that event is perceived as good or bad comes down to how your body immediately evaluates it. If you're right, it could be a good thing. If you're wrong, it could be a bad thing. Or you could be wrong and it could be a good thing. That's called contrastive valence, but we'll get to that later. At this point, the person's prediction was wrong. The early human did not make the right prediction. The next letter in the theory is R, and this is the reaction response. A reaction is an immediate, fast-tracked physiological response to whatever the outcome was. At this point, seeing the squirrel, the body might go into a parasympathetic
calming. Finally, the last letter of the theory is A, which is appraisal. Once these two fast-tracked things have happened, the prediction and the reaction, the early human can now take a moment to really think about what just happened. Were they right in their earlier prediction? How do they feel now that they've reacted? Was their attention used well? This primes and conditions humans to continue expecting things or to evaluate the impact of things that may or may not happen in the future. So enough talk about early humans. Let's get back to the music. Imagine you're at a concert and you begin to hear this piece being played.
Okay, so far this is a pleasant piece. Sounds pretty nice. Pretty boring, predictable. Yeah, maybe? No? Okay, all right. So I guess we're going back to, to do. This is easygoing, right? Okay. Oh, it's the same phrase. Oh, I can't believe I'm listening to the same phrase again. Oh man, I can't even. Oh. Whoa.
This cycle of a process follows us through our entire lives. It's encultured into us by all of our experiences, by the music we listen to, by the art we consume, and it has huge implications for how we might emotionally react. That appraisal that we get at the end of some type of expectation cycle, some type of ITPRA cycle, is going to move our behaviors to either encourage us to do something more, to like something more, to expect it more, or to even to avoid it or dislike it. For some people, when you can't expect anything happening, you're never gonna like it. The valence will just be too negative, and the appraisal is going to drive you away from it completely. Maybe if it sounds like this. That's a 12-tone piece by Anton Webern, and for a lot of first-time listeners to serialism, it's just so hard to predict and to understand, and whenever a new tone or a chromatic pitch occurs, we appraise it as negative. It's a constant cycle of not understanding what's about to happen. But when you think about it, the more you might listen to serialism, the less worried you get about that discomfort, the more you're able to predict the unpredictability. And maybe the more that you listen to it, the more you appraise that to be positive, and the more you might seek it out. Sometimes, just because we can't predict something doesn't mean we won't like it. That's that contrastive valence we mentioned earlier, and it's exactly why the deceptive cadence in American elegy actually drives us to feel good.
Today, modern composers have to do more than just write music. Their job is also to be a psychologist, setting us up, priming us for what's to come, and then gently violating our expectations.
Overall, David Huron's ITPRA theory does an excellent job not only summarizing the processes of expectation in human psychology, but also explaining how music takes us on an emotional journey. Emotion truly involves the entirety of the human organism, from physiological reactions to stimuli like goosebumps from a well-placed minor chord, to psychological appraisals like enjoyment. This theory shows us that expectation is an integral part in how humans experience and enjoy music. In general, David Huron's ITPRA framework does more than simply explain human psychology. It tells us how art touches us both emotionally and primitively as a species. So the next time you're listening to an enrapturing piece of music, ask yourself, did I see that coming?